The night Sable Arends was thrown from the royal galley, the tide was running out, and the moon had gone the color of a bruise under a bandage. She counted the links of the anchor chain as they wrapped her waist, because counting was the only habit 16 years of executioner's work had left her that still felt like prayer. 7 links at the hip, 4 around the ribs, the last one locked beneath her sternum, where a lover might, in another life, have rested his hand. The Crown's own chaplain read the sealed writ aloud, though the wind took every word but one, and that word was traitor. And Sable, who had heard the word said of better people than herself, did not flinch. She had dressed that morning expecting to behead a poacher. She was still wearing the leather apron. What she didn't know, as the deckhands heaved her up and the sea came rushing to meet her like a long-delayed appointment, was that the water below the galley was not empty, had not been empty for 200 years, and that the thing waiting in it had been counting too. Though what it counted were grudges, and the number was very high. She hit the morning straits with her mouth closed and her eyes open, and the cold went through her like a sentence being carried out, and she thought, with the flat, practical patience of a woman who had watched a great many people die, "Well, Sable, at least you won't have to clean the block in the morning." Then the chain pulled, and the dark pulled, and somewhere in the dark something enormous moved toward her with the absolute certainty of a creditor. She saw teeth before she saw eyes. She saw eyes before she understood that the teeth were tearing iron, not flesh. That the chain at her ribs was parting, link by link, like thread under a careful knife. That a paw the size of a shield had slid under her back and was lifting. The last thing she registered before the surface took her was that the creature smelled of salt and cedar and something older, something that had been waiting, and that its breath against her cheek was warm, and that warmth, after the cold, was the first thing in 16 years to feel like a trespass. She broke the surface in the jaws of a wolf the size of a cart horse, and the wolf was swimming, and the galley was already a small, cruel lantern, fading north. And Sable Arends, royal executioner of the coastal crown, did not weep, did not thank, did not beg. She spat seawater, looked the beast in its yellow eye, and said, with the cracked composure of someone resuming an interrupted conversation, "Put me down when you reach stone, please. I have an apron to wring out." The wolf's ear flicked. Something like a laugh vibrated through its chest and into her ribs. What she did not know, yet, was that the laugh had a name, and the name was Ruin Vask. And he had been told in a dream the night before that the sea would bring him a woman with a ledger in her mouth. He had expected a girl. He had expected weeping. He had not expected her. He carried her through the black water for nearly a league, past the tidal caves where his pack had been driven 3 generations ago by a king who wrote exile into law and called it mercy, past the old drowned pier where the first Vask Alpha had been shot in the throat with a silver bolt, past the barnacled bones of ships that had tried and failed to map this coast. And all the while, the woman in his jaws did not struggle, did not speak, did not so much as shiver in a way that asked for comfort. She bled quietly from the wrist where the manacle had bitten. She breathed. She watched the stars the way a surveyor watches a property line. When at last he climbed the black shingle of the hidden cove and set her down on a flat, warm stone near the mouth of the cave, and when the shift took him and the fur gave way to skin, and the skin to the shape of a man, tall, scarred across the collarbone in the pale signature of old silver, naked in the way of a thing that is not yet remembered to be ashamed, she looked at him the way she had looked at 1,000 condemned men, and said, evenly, "You've opened an interesting door, Wolf. I hope you've thought about who walks through it after me." Ruin Vask, who had rehearsed this meeting in his head for most of a century, found that he had not, in fact, thought about that at all. He wrapped her in a cloak that smelled of wood smoke and brine, because the cave had cloaks, because the cave had many things, because the Vask pack had been living inside the kingdom's blind spot for 100 years and had learned to keep its house. He did not touch her more than he had to. His hands, when they adjusted the wool at her throat, were careful in a way his face was not. The face was stone, the jaw a flexed hinge, the eyes the color of rained-on slate, but the hands remembered that she had just been drowned, and moved as if she might shatter. Sable noticed everything. It was the first habit of her trade. She filed his carefulness next to the silver scar on his collarbone and the way his breath had caught, once, when her wet hair brushed his wrist. And she thought, oh. And then she thought, no. And then she thought, later. And then she sat down on the stone and asked for water. He brought it in a horn cup. She drank it in 3 measured swallows. She did not thank him. She said, I assume you pulled me out for a reason, and I assume the reason has a price. And I would like to know the price before the feeling comes back into my feet, because I find I negotiate better without sensation. Ruin sat across from her on his heels, the cloak he had thrown around his own shoulders open at the chest, and studied her the way a man studies a map that has turned out to be drawn on the back of a will. You know names, he said. His voice was low and rough and calm, and Sable, who had a trained ear for voices that were calm because they were choosing to be, understood immediately that she was being spoken to by something that could have roared. I know names, she agreed. I know where the bodies are. I know which writs were sealed and which were shouted. I know which nobles the crown has quietly put in the ground, and which noble women were told their husbands drowned when in fact they did not. I have been the hand. The hand remembers. Ruin's jaw did the flex she had already catalogued. And would you speak those names? He said, to the right listener. Sable tilted her head. That depends, she said, on whether the right listener wants the throne to fall or wants the throne to be corrected. I have no use for rubble. I have a great deal of use for a functioning block and a steady wage. Ruin stared at her for a long moment, and a sound moved in his chest that was not quite a growl and not quite a laugh. And somewhere deeper than that, in a place she could not yet hear, a second voice, older than his human one, said clearly, Oh, it is her. It is her. Of course it is her. Look at her. She is not afraid of us. Ruin, who had spent most of his life keeping that second voice chained, found that the chain had just quietly unhooked itself. He did not tell her. He said instead, You are not what I expected. Sable looked at him over the rim of the horn cup, and the corner of her mouth moved in something that was not a smile, but was the place a smile would live if she ever let one. No one has ever expected me correctly, she said. It is why I am still alive. She set the cup down. Now, she said, I will tell you 3 things for free, because you pulled me out of the water and because I owed debts promptly. 1. The queen consort was poisoned with a compound called still lily, and only 3 people in the kingdom know how to brew it, and one of them is the king. 2. The king does not know that I know that, which is why he used a sealed writ instead of a public trial. 3. The other 2 who can brew still lily are a woman named Janelle, who keeps the northern still room, and a man named Edson, who used to be the royal apothecary and was retired, quietly, to a cottage on the cliffs 6 months ago. And I would bet the apron I am still wearing that Edson is already dead, and Janelle has been promised something she will not live to collect. Ruin was very still. You know this, he said, Because you were meant to kill them. I know this, Sable said, because I was meant to kill them next week. Dawn came slow and gray over the tidal caves, and with it came the pack, in ones and twos, padding in from the deeper galleries, with the soft-footed curiosity of a household that has heard a guest has arrived. Sable, wrapped now in a proper shift of undyed linen and a heavier cloak the color of wet slate, sat by a small driftwood fire and watched them the way she had once watched a new set of apprentices at the block, cataloging which ones would flinch, which ones would bite, which ones would be useful, which ones would die first if it came to that. A boy of perhaps 9, barefoot and grinning, with a gap where a milk tooth had lately been, stopped 3 paces from her, tilted his head, and said, "You smell like iron and rain and something sad. Are you going to live here now?" Sable considered him. He did not flinch from her face, which was a novelty. Most children at court had been taught to cross themselves when the executioner passed. "That depends," she said gravely, "on whether the cave has room for another sad-smelling woman." The boy considered this with equal gravity. "We have lots of room," he said. "I am Chip. My mother is Verity, and she is the pack's healer. And she says you are going to be important, which is annoying because she also says I have to share my blanket with you tonight, and it is my favorite blanket." Sable felt something very small and very warm move in her chest. For the first time since the galley, she said, "I will try to be important somewhere else, so you can keep your blanket." Chip laughed the way small children laugh, all at once and without planning. And Ruin, across the fire, looked at the two of them and forgot for a full 3 seconds that he was supposed to be a weapon. Verity came a moment later, a broad-shouldered woman with gray threaded through her braid, and Chip's same direct eyes, and she knelt beside Sable without ceremony and took her bleeding wrist in both hands. "You were chained with ship iron," she said. "That will bruise for a month. The cold will take longer. Drink what I give you and do not argue." Sable, who had not been told not to argue by anyone in 16 years, found that she did not want to. She drank. The tisane tasted of moss and honey and something that made her teeth ache pleasantly. Verity watched her face and said quietly, so that only Sable could hear, "He has not looked at anyone that way before." Sable did not pretend not to understand. "I am 37, she said also quietly, "and I has been the crown's headswoman for 16 years, and I have never in my life been looked at as anything other than a tool or a terror. Whatever your alpha thinks he sees, healer, he is going to have to accept that I am not a bride, and I am not a banner, and I am not a weapon to be picked up and set down at his convenience." Verity's mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile. "I will tell him," she said, "though I suspect he already knows. And I suspect it is precisely why he cannot look away." She rose. She left a small stoppered jar by Sable's knee and said, "For the nightmares." And then she collected Chip by the scruff the way one collects a determined kitten and took him off to be fed. Ruin waited until the cave had settled again before he spoke. He had dressed in rough, dark wool and a leather overtunic that did nothing to diminish the breadth of him. He sat on the far side of the fire and did not come closer. "You said 3 things for free," he said. "I will trade you for the rest." Sable raised an eyebrow. "Your currency, wolf." "I can offer you sanctuary," he said. "I can offer you the pack between you and every sword the crown owns. I can offer you a bed and food and a name in our records that is not the name you were sentenced under. I can offer you the one thing the coastal crown has never offered a woman in your position, which is the right to stop." Sable was quiet a long time. The firelight moved on his face and found the scar on his collarbone, the one shaped like a spill of pale wax. And she thought about silver, and about how silver was the thing her trade had taught her to keep away from her blades, because it fouled the edge. She thought then about what it would foul in him. "Stop," she repeated. "You don't understand," she said. "I don't want to stop." Ruin's brows drew together. "I want to go back," Sable said. "I want my block and my apron and my wage. I took that post at 21 because it was the only place in this kingdom where a woman could carry a blade openly and be paid for it. And I have been paid every quarter for 16 years. And I have buried my mother on that wage. And I have kept my sister's children in bread on that wage. And no wolf, however large, is going to tell me that being dragged out of the sea is the same thing as being given permission to quit." Ruin stared at her. Something behind his eyes moved that was not his. He opened his mouth, closed it, and said very carefully, "You want to go back to the man who tried to drown you." "I want," Sable said, "to go back to the job. The man is a separate problem. One I am, admittedly, now somewhat motivated to solve. But the job, Wolf, the job is mine, and I did not spend 16 years earning the right to swing a blade in daylight, only to be told by a handsome stranger with good teeth that my retirement has been arranged." Ruin blinked. "Handsome," he said, as if the word had caught on something. Sable's mouth did that thing again that was not a smile. "Focus," she said. He did not at first know how to focus. The inner wolf, which had been chained for most of his adult life, under the strict discipline required of an alpha in exile, had gotten loose at the words, "handsome stranger with good teeth," and was currently pacing in small, delighted circles somewhere behind his sternum, saying, "She noticed, she noticed, she noticed our teeth." Ruin, outwardly, did not move. Inwardly, he informed the wolf that they were in the middle of a negotiation with a woman who had watched 200 executions and had the emotional affect of a well-kept ledger, and that any further commentary would be noted and ignored. The wolf, unrepentant, lay down and put its chin on its paws and continued to watch her with the soft, besotted patience of a creature that had waited its entire life for exactly this, and could afford, now, to be patient a little longer. Ruin cleared his throat. "Very well," he said. "The job is yours. I will not ask you to give it up. But you cannot go back yet, because the moment you set foot on the Capitol stones, the king will finish what the chain started, and I did not tear through ship iron with my teeth to watch you walk back into a sealed writ out of professional pride." He paused. "Also," he said, a little lower, "I would prefer not to." Sable, who had heard a great many things from a great many men and had learned to sort the honest from the rehearsed by the shape of the pause before them, heard that pause and filed it. "I accept the logic," she said. "I do not accept the tone. If I am to remain in your cave, Ruin Vask, we will establish one rule, and the rule is this. You will not look at me as though I am something you have been waiting for, because I am not. And because looking at me that way will make it harder for both of us to think. And I need both of us to think, because your king and mine are the same man, and he is presently assuming I am feeding the crabs." Ruin's jaw did the flex. "I will try," he said. "Try harder," she said. He almost smiled. He did not. He said instead, "Tell me what the still lily does." Sable told him. She told him, plainly and without ornament, how the compound was brewed from the late bloom of a specific marsh flower, how it took 40 days of steeping in copper, how the final reduction smelled like almonds and salt, how the dose required was so small that a ring with a hollow stone could carry 6 kills in it without the wearer noticing the weight. She told him how she knew this because 3 years ago she had been quietly asked to dispose of a noblewoman named Alira Vesh, who had refused the king's bed and threatened to tell her husband, and how the writ for that execution had been sealed, and how the king's own cupbearer had delivered the ring afterwards to a lockbox in the executioner's vault, because the executioner's vault was the one place in the palace no one searched. She told him that the lockbox was still there. She told him that the lockbox contained, by her count, 9 rings, 4 vials, 2 sealed confessions, and a register in the king's own hand, listing which of the kingdom's quietly dead had been killed for politics, and which had been killed for the queen consort's predecessor's jealousy, and which had been killed because the king was bored. She told him, lastly, that the register listed her as the executing hand on 31 of them, which meant that if the register ever surfaced, she would hang with the king, and that she was therefore, professionally speaking, highly motivated to ensure the register surfaced only under conditions she controlled. Ruin listened without moving. When she was done, he said quietly, "You are not a ledger. You are the ledger's author." Sable inclined her head. "I am the ledger's custodian," she corrected. "The author is still on his throne." "But yes, essentially." Ruin was silent a long moment. Then he said, "What do you want?" Sable looked at him over the fire, and for the first time something in her face that had been locked for a very long time moved, just a little. "I want," she said, "the king replaced by his nephew, who is 14 and biddable, and not yet cruel, and who will sign a decree I will write personally reinstating my post under a new seal, and pardoning every border community the current king has outlawed, including, incidentally, yours. I want the lockbox recovered, and its contents used precisely once, in precisely the right chamber, in front of precisely the right witnesses. I want the 2 other brewers of Still Lily, Janelle and Edson, accounted for, living or dead, so that no one can ever brew that compound again without my knowledge. And I want, when it is all done, to walk back into my own quarters and find my apron where I left it, and my block clean, and my wage current. And I want to be left alone to do my work, which is, whatever you may think of it, the only work in this kingdom I have ever been fitted for." Ruin watched her across the fire. "And me," he said. "What do you want from me?" Sable considered him a long time. "Your teeth," she said at last, "on the chain the next time one comes for me. Your pack between my back and the sea. Your silence when I am thinking. Your honesty when I am wrong. And Wolf," she paused, and the pause was hers, not rehearsed. "Your patience. Because I have not in my life been courted, and I will not be hurried. And if you look at me one more time like I am something you have been waiting for, I may, against my better judgment, start to believe you. And then we will both be in trouble." Ruin's hand closed slowly on his knee. The scar at his collarbone moved as he swallowed. "I can do patience," he said, in the low, rough voice that was working very hard to remain low and rough. "I have had practice." Sable's mouth did the almost smile. "Good," she said. "Start now." They moved her deeper into the caves the next day, because the tidal chambers flooded at springtide, and because Ruin did not trust the outer galleries against a determined search. The inner caves were older than the pack. They had been a place of pilgrimage once, before the exile, before the silver bolts and the sealed decrees. There were carvings in the walls that Sable did not recognize, but whose shapes caught at something behind her eyes. A pale fire shape curled around a smaller figure. A hand held out in benediction. A wolf seated at the hand's feet like a hound at a hearth. She stopped in front of one of them and stood looking at it longer than she meant to. Verity, passing with an armful of clean linen, paused beside her and said softly, They are older than the kingdom, older than the crown that exiled us, older than the word executioner. The oldest of our stories say that once, before the silver and the chains, there walked among the coastal people a line of women who carried fire in their hands and used it to burn corruption out of bonded pairs, and that the last of them was driven into the sea, along with the last of us, because the crown did not like to be looked at by a light it could not own. Sable did not turn her head. "And you are telling me this," she said, because, Verity said, "you stopped at that carving, and none of our children stop at that carving, and neither does Ruin. And I have been watching, and I am a healer, and it is my work to notice." She did not say more. She adjusted the linen in her arms and walked on. And Sable stood there a moment longer and looked at the fire shape in the stone and felt, somewhere low in her ribs, the faintest, inexplicable hum, as though a string she had not known was strung in her had been touched, once, and released. She told herself it was the tisane. She walked on. That night, they set her a pallet in a side chamber with a curtain of rough weave across the entrance, and Chip, true to his mother's word, brought his favorite blanket and laid it across her feet with the solemnity of a courtier delivering a treaty, and then crawled under her elbow and fell asleep there, with the boneless trust of a thing that had decided. And Sable, who had not slept with another body near her in 16 years, lay awake a long time, looking at the cave ceiling and trying to remember how breathing had worked before she had to plan each one. Ruin came to the curtain, did not enter, said only, through the weave, "There is a watch on the cove. You are not alone. Call if you need." She said, "I am fine, Wolf." He said, "I know." He did not leave at once. She heard him breathe out, once, the way a man breathes out when he has been holding something, and he was gone. She slept, eventually, and dreamed of a shore she had never seen, and of a fire that did not burn her, and of a voice that said, "It is time you woke up, Sable. It is long past time." She woke at false dawn, with Chip's hair against her jaw, and her own hand, inexplicably, warm. Over the next 7 days they built, between them, the beginnings of a plan. Ruin knew the coastline. Sable knew the palace. Ruin knew which of the fishing villages still fed the pack in secret. Sable knew which of the palace kitchens was run by a woman whose cousin had been hanged on a false writ, and would, if asked correctly, carry a message. Ruin knew the title schedule of the galley patrols. Sable knew the rotation of the inner guard, and which of them had taken bribes from which noble, and which of them could be flipped for the price of a pardoned brother. They sat at the driftwood fire in the evenings with a chart Ruin had drawn on a dried sealskin, and Sable made marks on it with a charred stick, and their hands, occasionally, when reaching for the same spot, touched. And each time they touched, Sable felt the hum in her ribs and filed it next to the silver scar and told herself firmly, later. Ruin, for his part, did not comment, did not linger, did not press. He moved his hand away with the deliberate slowness of a man diffusing something. The inner wolf, behind his sternum, took to lying down dramatically every time this happened and sighing at great length. Ruin ignored it. On the 7th evening, Chip ran into the chamber with a gull's feather in his hair and announced, breathless, that a boat had come in at the blind cove with a message for the Alpha, and that the message was from the palace, and that the man who brought it said it was from someone called the Queen Mother, and that it was for the woman with the apron. Sable set down her charred stick. Ruin went very still. "The Queen Mother," Sable said slowly, "has been dead for 11 years. Chip blinked. "The man said, 'She said you would say that,'" he reported. "And he said to tell you the apron is still on its hook and the block is still clean, and the wage has been paid into the Northern Stillroom account for the last 7 days as if nothing had happened. And he said to tell you that Janelle is alive, and that Janelle says the king's ring has 6 stones in it now, not 5. And he said to tell you that Edson is not dead, and he said that the nephew has been moved to the summer keep for his protection. And he said to tell you that someone in the palace has been keeping your place, and that someone says it is time you came home." Sable, for the first time since the galley, felt something sharp move through her that was not calculation. She stood up slowly. She looked at Ruin across the fire, and the hum in her ribs had gone from a whisper to a drawn string, and her hands, the steady executioner's hands, were not steady. "Who?" she said. "Who in that palace is keeping my place?" Chip, who did not understand the question but understood the tone, recited, "The man said to tell you her name was Danny, and that she said you would understand." Sable sat down again very suddenly on the flat stone and put her face in her hands, and Ruin, who had never seen her do any such thing, came around the fire without thinking, and knelt in front of her, and did not touch her, but put both his hands, palms up, on the stone between them, the way a man offers a starving dog something to sniff. "Danny," Sable said into her hands. "Danielle. My apprentice. She is 19. I took her on 2 years ago because her mother was a laundress, and because she had hands that did not shake, and because she asked me, directly, if the work would teach her how to survive a court, and I said yes, and she said, 'Then teach me.' And I have been teaching her for 2 years, and she has been—" She stopped. "She has been," she said, "the one person in that palace who has ever looked at me as though I were a human being and not a function. And she has kept my place." Ruin's hands did not move on the stone. His voice, when it came, was gentler than Sable had known it could be. Then, he said, "She is on the board now, Sable. We will need to plan for her." Sable lowered her hands. Her eyes were dry, but something in them had changed, had softened and hardened at once, the way a blade changes when it is quenched. "Yes," she said. "We will." She looked at Ruin, and, she said after a pause, "Thank you." He inclined his head and said nothing, because he knew, already, that she did not often say it, and that saying anything back would diminish it. Between them, on the sealskin chart, the charred stick had rolled, in her startle, into the mark that stood for the palace. Neither of them moved it. The plan sharpened. Sable wrote, in her own hand, on a scrap of oiled parchment, a single sentence and a single symbol, and gave it to the fisherman to carry back to Danielle. And the sentence was, "The ledger is safe. Keep your hands steady." And the symbol was the mark of the executioner's vault, which only 2 people in the kingdom could draw correctly, and Sable was one of them, and Danielle was the other. She did not sign it. Danielle would know. 3 days later, the fisherman came back with a different scrap and a different sentence, in Danielle's blockish, careful hand, and it said, "The king is searching the vault. He has not found it. He will not find it. But he is asking about the woman who trained me, and I am telling him what you would tell him, which is nothing. And I am asking you, Sable, to come home before he decides to stop asking me with words." Sable read it by the fire and did not say anything for a long time. Ruin watched her read it. When she finally folded it, she said, quietly, "She is protecting me." Ruin said, "She is your apprentice." Sable said, "She is a child." And Ruin, who had watched her closely enough over the past 10 days to know that Sable Irens used the word child exactly twice, once of Chip and once of this girl, understood that the timeline had just shortened. They went that night, because the tide was right and because the king's patience with Danielle would not be. Ruin did not try to talk her out of it. He did, however, insist on coming with her, and on bringing 4 of his pack, and on timing the landing to the turning of the guard at the sea gate, and on giving her a knife the length of her forearm that had been forged, he told her, before the Silver laws, and could, if it came to that, part a king's ribs as cleanly as any ceremonial blade. Sable took the knife. She weighed it, she said. "This is very fine work, Wolf." And Ruin, gruffly, said, "It was my mother's." And Sable looked up at him and did not say anything. And something very small passed between them that neither of them named. They landed below the sea gate at the dead hour. The pack went first, low and silent, and Sable followed with Ruin at her shoulder, and they moved up through the service tunnels the way Sable had moved for 16 years to reach her block. And at a certain point, in a dark stretch between 2 sconces, Ruin caught her elbow and drew her into the shadow of an arch because a patrol was coming. And they pressed there together for the count of 12. And she could feel his breath against her temple, and the hum in her ribs was very loud. And he turned his head and looked down at her, and the look was not patient anymore. It was something else. And she tipped her face up almost without deciding to, and his mouth was very close to hers, close enough that she felt the warmth of it, close enough that her breath would have been a kiss. And then the patrol's boots rang on the flagstone beyond the arch, and a voice said, "Halt! Who goes?" And they did not kiss. They moved, and Sable's hand found the knife, and Ruin's shoulder rolled into the shift, and they took the patrol in the silence that was Sable's trade and his nature both, and the moment under the arch was left behind them, unfinished, and neither of them spoke of it, because there was no time. But the hum in Sable's ribs did not quiet again for the rest of the night. They reached the executioner's vault. Danielle was waiting. She was 19 and tall and pale and had, Sable noted with approval, not slept in 3 nights, and she threw her arms around Sable without ceremony, and then immediately stepped back, because she had been taught better, and said crisply, "The lockbox is moved. I moved it when the king's men came. It is in the north still room now, under Janelle's floorboards." Janelle agreed. "Janelle says to tell you she is tired of being a brewer for a murderer and would like to retire. And also, mistress, Edson is not dead. Edson is in the summer keep with the nephew. Edson has been writing down everything for 11 years. Edson has a 2nd register, and Edson says if you come get him, he will give it to you, and then he would like to be allowed to keep bees." Sable absorbed all of this without blinking. Then she said, "Danny, this is Ruin Vask. He is a wolf. He is with me. Do not be afraid of him." Danielle said, "I am not afraid of him, mistress. I have read about the Vask line in the Crown's sealed histories. The Crown has been lying about you for 2 centuries, sir," Ruin said, softly. "I know," Danielle said. "I am glad someone saved her." And Sable, who had been standing upright for a very long time, felt her shoulders drop, just fractionally. And Ruin, who had been watching for exactly that, very carefully did not react. They took the lockbox. They took Janelle, who came willingly and with a bag already packed. They took, 2 nights later, Edson and the nephew, both out of the summer keep. And Edson, true to his word, produced from under his bed a leather-bound 2nd register in his own hand. And the nephew, who was 14 and solemn and had his grandmother's eyes, looked at Sable and said, "Are you the woman my uncle had drowned?" And Sable said, "Yes, your grace." And he said, "I am sorry." And she said, "You did not do it." And he said, "No, but I would like to be the kind of king who does not do it either. Please help me." And Sable, executioner of the coastal crown, looked at the boy and thought, "Oh," and said, "Yes." It was Janelle, in the end, who put the last piece in Sable's hand. They were back in the tidal caves by then, the nephew safe in the inner galleries under Verity's watch, Edson installed in a side chamber with a stack of parchment and a bemused expression and the promise of bees to follow. Danielle sharpening blades at the fire the way a young person sharpens blades when they have something to say and are not sure how to say it. Janelle was a small, broad woman in her 60s, with ink-stained fingers and a mouth that had not smiled since her apprentice had been quietly disappeared 4 years ago. And she came to Sable on the 11th morning and set down, on the sealskin chart, a single, small ring. Sable looked at it. 6 stones, she said. 6 stones, Janelle agreed, and he wears it on his left hand now, which means he is planning to use it soon. And the only person at that table next month who matters enough for him to use it on is the nephew. Sable was quiet. And, Janelle said, I would like to tell you one more thing, Mistress Executioner. And it is the thing I have been afraid to tell anyone for 11 years. And it is this. The king did not brew the still lily himself. He cannot. He never could. He does not have the hand for it. The third brewer, the one you have been looking for, is not a man. It is his cousin, Lady Murray of Harrowwater. She has been brewing for him since before he took the throne. She is the one who poisoned the queen consort. She is the one who sealed your writ. She is the one who has been feeding him names for 16 years and quietly sorting the court into the ones who can be used and the ones who must be buried. And she has done it all from the chair at his right hand that everyone assumes is ornamental. And she is, mistress, the one who is going to kill the nephew at the Solstice table, because she has decided that her own son will sit the throne next, and she has been decided about this since before the current king's wife drew her last breath. Sable did not move. Lady Murray, she repeated. Janelle nodded. I have been brewing for her directly for the last 4 years, Janelle said. The king thinks he orders me. He does not. She does. She pays me in my apprentice's bones, which she has promised to return if I keep brewing, and which I have now decided, mistress, that I will never receive, because my apprentice has been dead since the day she took her, and I have been a fool, and I am done being a fool. Sable reached across the chart and took Janelle's ink-stained hand in her own steady one and held it, once, and let it go. Thank you, she said. I am sorry about your girl. Janelle's eyes were wet but did not spill. So am I, she said. Ruin across the fire had gone very still in the way that meant the wolf was listening too, and Sable could see in the set of his shoulders the calculation rearranging itself, the brute suitor king demoted to decoy, the polished insider revealed as the engine, the whole board tilting. She let him sit with it. She said, aloud to no one in particular, the decoy was the throne. The throne was always the decoy. The throne is a chair, wolves and apprentices and brewers, and a chair does not poison a queen. A hand does. And the hand, all this time, has been sitting to the king's right in a green gown, smiling at the musicians. She looked up. We move at the solstice, she said. We move in her own brewing hall. We use her own ring. Ruin's mouth moved at last in something that was almost a smile. Poetic, he said. Sable said practical. They argued that night about whether she would be in the room. Ruin, for the first time, let the wolf surface enough that his eyes went pale gold, and he said, low and almost shaking, You are not walking into her hall, Sable. She has been planning your death for longer than you have been planning hers. And Sable, steady as blockwood, said, I am the only person in this kingdom who can identify that ring by its weight, the only person who can verify the brew by its scent, the only person whose testimony the council will accept. And I am the only person she will not expect, because she thinks I am 3 leagues down with crabs in my hair. And if I am not in that room, Wolf, then she walks. And if she walks, the nephew dies at the next solstice, and Edson dies, and Danielle dies, and Janelle dies, and eventually you die, because she will find you. She finds everyone. Ruin breathed in through his teeth. I know, he said. I know. I do not have to like it. He closed his eyes a moment, and the gold receded. When he opened them, they were slate again. Then, he said, I go with you as far as the hall. I will not go in. I will not make you smaller in that room by standing behind you. But if she so much as lifts that ring, Sable, I will come through the wall. Sable considered him. That, she said, is acceptable. He exhaled. Good, he said. And, he said, more quietly, about the arch. Sable's mouth did the almost smile for the 3rd time in 12 days. After, she said. He nodded. After, he agreed. Behind his sternum, the wolf, radiant, said, After, after, after. She said after, and Ruin said, Hush. That night, Chip crawled under her elbow again and said, sleepily, You smell different. Sable said, How? Chip said, Like you're not sad anymore, just busy. Then he fell asleep. Sable lay awake a long time, and the hum in her ribs was not quiet, and she did not know yet what it was, but she no longer doubted it was there. The solstice came with a cold, clear sky, and Lady Murray of Harrowwater, who had prepared for this day for 16 years, was wearing her grandmother's emeralds and the ring with 6 stones on her left hand, and she was smiling at the musicians, and she did not look up when the side door of her private brewing hall opened, because only 3 people in the kingdom had the right to open that door without knocking, and she was one of them, and the king was another, and the 3rd had been drowned 3 weeks ago and was feeding crabs. She looked up eventually, because the footsteps did not stop at the threshold. She looked up, and she saw Sable Arends in her leather apron, with her own executioner's blade at her hip, and a knife as long as her forearm in her other hand. And behind Sable, the king's own nephew, 14 and solemn, with Edson at his shoulder holding a leather-bound register, and behind them, the council. The full council, all 12 of them, summoned quietly in the last 6 hours by Danielle's careful messengers. And behind them, framed in the doorway like something out of an older story, a tall man with slate-gray eyes and a silver scar at his collarbone, who did not step into the hall, but his presence filled it anyway. Lady Murray's smile did not drop at once. She had been a courtier too long for that, she said pleasantly. Sable, darling, I was told you had gone sea-bathing. Sable said, I came back. Then she sat down on the long brewing table between them, the lockbox, and beside it Edson's register, and beside that Janelle, who stepped out from behind Edson with her ink-stained hands folded and her mouth, at last, set in the first hard line it had worn in 4 years. Murray's eyes flicked from the lockbox to Janelle to the ring on her own finger, and the calculation behind her face did what calculation does when it realizes it has been outweighted. She moved then because she was not stupid. Her hand went to the ring and her thumb to the hollow stone, and she flicked the catch in a single practiced motion, and a fine mist of still lilies sprayed across the brewing table toward the nephew, who was closest, and Sable, who had been waiting for exactly this, was already moving. And so was Ruin. And so, unexpectedly, was something else. Sable threw herself in front of the boy. She did it the way she did everything, without drama, without hesitation, with the flat, professional patience of someone who had decided a long time ago what she was for. She stepped between Mireille's ring and the nephew's open mouth, and caught the mist across her own face and throat, and she heard Ruin's voice, not a shout, a sound deeper than a shout. And she heard Danielle scream her name, and she heard the nephew say, "No." And she felt the poison go into her skin and her eyes and her lungs. And she thought, with the last clear thought she expected to have, "Well, Sable, this is a better ending than the chain." And then something in her chest, something that had been humming for 3 weeks and singing in her dreams for longer than that, something that had been carved into cave walls older than the kingdom, opened. It did not feel like fire. It felt like a held breath released. It felt like a door she had been leaning against all her life, giving way at last, and letting her stand up. A pale fire rose off her skin, the color of clean silver, and the still lily mist caught in it and simply unbecame, particle by particle, like salt in rain. And the pale fire kept rising, and it found the ring on Mireille's hand, and ate the hollow stone out of its setting. And it found the 6 vials in the lockbox, and unmade them too. And it found, curling back along the table like a tide, the thin old residue of still lily that had lived under Mireille's fingernails for a decade, and unmade that. And Mireille, who had been reaching for a second weapon, staggered backward, because the light had touched her wrist, and where it touched her there was nothing, no wound, no burn, simply the absence of what had been corrupt in her. And what was left of her, stripped, turned out to be very little. She went to her knees, her mouth opened. The council, who had come expecting a trial, found themselves in the presence of something that predated trials. Sable stood in the middle of the pale fire, with her eyes closed and her hands open, and the hum in her chest had become a quiet, clear note, and she heard, inside it, a voice older than Ruin's inner wolf, and older than the kingdom, and older than her trade. And the voice said, "Welcome back, daughter. It has been a long time." And Sable, executioner of the coastal crown, answered it silently. "Yes, it has. Thank you for waiting." When she opened her eyes, the fire was gone. Mireille was on her knees in a green gown that no longer fit her. The nephew was alive. The still lily was not. Ruin was at her elbow, though she had not seen him cross the room, and his hand was hovering a half-inch from her waist, in the careful way of a man who has been told not to touch and is reconsidering his compliance. Sable swayed. She said, "Steady, Wolf," and he caught her under the arms. And the council, at last, found its voice. And the voice that spoke first was the eldest counselor, a woman of 70 who had known Sable's mother, and she said, quietly, into the ringing silence, "Lady Mireille of Harrowwater, you are accused, before 12 witnesses and the heir apparent and the executioner of the coastal crown and a light older than this court, of the murder of the queen consort and the attempted murder of the heir. And I ask, by ancient right, is there any voice to speak for you?" No voice spoke. Mireille, for the first and last time in her life, said nothing. The eldest counselor turned to Sable. "Mistress Executioner," she said, "the sentence is yours, by your office and by your survival." Sable looked at Mireille a long time. The woman on the floor was shaking, and her hands were open on her knees, and the emeralds at her throat had gone dull. She thought about the writ. She thought about the chain. She thought about Janelle's apprentice, whose bones had been used as currency. She thought about the 31 sealed names in the register that stood between her and her own scaffold. And she thought, with the flat professional patience that had kept her alive for 16 years, about what kind of woman she would be on the other side of this moment. "Exile," she said, "to the far islands, under the nephew's seal, unarmed, unattended, unfunded. She will live out her life in a place where there is no still lily to brew and no court to poison. And if she returns to this coast in any season or under any name, I will take her head myself, and I will do it without ceremony." The eldest counselor inclined her head. "So ordered," she said. "The king," Sable said, "is a separate question. I leave him to you, counselors. He poisoned his own wife through this woman's hand, and he sealed my writ through this woman's hand. But he signed both, and the signature is his, and I am not, today, in the business of kings. I am in the business of this child." She rested a hand briefly on the nephew's shoulder, learning how not to be one of them. The council went to find the king. He was, it turned out, already in the North Tower, drinking, because he had, in his own small way, understood before anyone else what the opening of that side door meant. And he did not resist when they took him, and he was confined, and in the weeks that followed, by the nephew's first signed decree, he was sent to the same far islands as his cousin, under the same terms, and neither of them ever came back. And the islands, it was said, were very quiet, and very cold, and very unbrewable. And that was the end of it. The nephew was crowned in the spring, because the council insisted on a full mourning for the queen consort first, and because Sable insisted on teaching him for the winter, and because Ruin, privately to Sable, admitted that he would like a season to be simply in the same room with her without plotting anything. And Sable, privately to Ruin, said, yes, that would be acceptable. The first decree the boy king signed, at 14, in a careful hand that did not shake, reinstated Sable Irens to the post of royal executioner of the coastal crown, under a new seal that pardoned her for 31 sealed writs she had carried out under his uncle's hand, and specified, in a clause she had written herself, and he had read and approved, that from that day forward no writ in the kingdom could be sealed. Every sentence would be spoken aloud in a public hall, and no hand would be asked to take a life that had not first been named in the hearing of 12 citizens. The second decree lifted the exile of the Vasque Pack and every other coastal community driven out by his uncle's grandfathers, and returned to them, by name, the tidal coves and the cliff villages and the inland meadows that had been theirs before the Silver Laws. The third decree, which the boy had written himself and had made Sable read twice before he signed, established a small stipend for one Chip, son of Verity, for the lifetime purchase of blankets, because, he said, a woman had told him that a good king remembers which of his people are small. Sable had laughed, then, properly, for the first time in a great many years, and the laugh had surprised everyone in the room, including her, and Ruin, who had been across the chamber at the window, had turned his head at the sound with the look of a man who has just been given a piece of news he had not known he was waiting for. They were married, in a manner of speaking, in the early summer, at the mouth of the tidal cave where he had first set her down, on the warm, flat stone, because neither of them had any interest in the court chapel, and because Verity said the cave had witnessed their first honest look, and deserved to witness the rest. Chip carried the ribbons. Danielle stood at Sable's shoulder in a good gray dress and sharpened no blades for the whole afternoon, which was, for her, a declaration. Edson brought honey from his new hives. Janelle, who had retired to a cottage 2 coves down and was raising herbs that were not still lily, brought a small bottle of something that turned out to be very good wine. There were no vows spoken of fate, because Sable had refused to have fate mentioned in her own ceremony, on the grounds that she had done all of this with her hands and her head, and had no patience with credit being given to a concept. There was, instead, one short exchange, which was this. Ruin said, "I will keep your silence when you are thinking, and your back when you are working, and your bed when you are willing, and your name when you are not here to say it." And Sable said, "I will keep your secrets, and your teeth sharp, and your wolf warm, and your patience, wolf, which you have earned." And then she rose on her toes and bit him, quite deliberately, at the join of his neck and shoulder. And the pack, watching, said, "Oh," all at the same time, and Ruin, whose inner wolf behind his sternum was doing something that could only be described as howling with joy, managed, outwardly, only to close his eyes and breathe out and say, "Sable," in a voice that contained entire years, and then bent his head and returned the gesture at her own throat, gently, carefully, the way he did everything that touched her, and the hum in her ribs, which had been a note, became a chord. They did not go back to the caves that night. He had built her, over the winter, a small stone house at the top of the cliff above the blind cove, with a door that opened toward the sea, and a hearth wide enough for 2 dogs and a boy king in a chair, because he had suspected the boy king would visit, and she had, privately, approved of every stone. That night, in that house, behind a door that closed with a soft finality that the old Sable would have catalogued as a transition beat, and the new Sable simply heard as the sound of a day ending well, they finished what the arch in the palace tunnels had started, and he was careful with her the way he was careful with everything that mattered to him, and she was, for the first time in her adult life, not careful at all. And afterwards, in the dark, with his hand resting low on her belly, the way a man rests a hand on a warm stone, he said quietly, "Sable, I will tell you a thing I have known for some weeks." And she said, "Yes, Wolf." And he said, "The hum in your chest is answering mine, and the pack has been hearing it, and Verity says it means we have already made the bond, and she also says, and I am telling you this at her instruction, because she thinks you should hear it from me first, and not from Chip, who is bad at secrets, that you are, as of some point around the solstice, carrying." Sable was quiet for a long time. Then she said into the dark, "Ruin Vask, if you are telling me I am 37 years old and pregnant by a shore wolf alpha in a cliff house above a cove older than the kingdom, I will need a moment." He said, "Take your moment." She took her moment. Then she began, helplessly, to laugh, and he laughed with her, low and rough and surprised. And outside the house, the sea did what the sea had always done, which was turn, and the turning sounded, tonight, like a blessing. In the early autumn of the following year, on a clear morning with the wind off the sea, Sable Loren sat in a chair at the open door of the cliff house, with a small, dark-haired infant asleep against her collarbone, and a block of oak at her feet that her apprentice, Danielle, now the deputy executioner of the coastal crown under the new public seal, had delivered from the capital for inspection. And Chip, who was 10 now, and no longer missing a tooth, was sitting on the stone step with the pack's newest pup, asleep across his shins, and Ruin, at the hearth inside, was arguing with the boy king, who had grown 4 inches and was visiting, about whether the northern fisheries could sustain a second season of open license. And Verity, at the table, was adjudicating. Sable listened to all of it with her eyes half closed and the baby's breath warm against her neck, and she thought, idly, that the warm, flat stone in the cove where Ruin had first set her down was visible from this chair, and that the pale fire shape carved into the cave wall had, since the solstice, been joined by a second carving that Verity and the elders had added without telling her. A woman with fire in her hands and a wolf seated at her feet, like a hound at a hearth. And that the carving was, by some accounts, the oldest story being told for the first time in a long time, and by other accounts, simply a very good likeness. The baby shifted. Sable adjusted her arm. Ruin looked up from the hearth and across the room at her, and his slate eyes did the thing they had been doing since the tidal cave, which was to find her first and settle. And Sable, who had refused for 3 weeks to be looked at like something he had been waiting for, let him look, and looked back, and the hum in her ribs sang quietly, and was answered. If you have been listening this far, storytellers are nothing without listeners, and I would very much like to know what you thought of Sable, and Ruin, and Chip, and the cliff house above the blind cove. So please rate this story for me from 1 to 10 in the comments, 1 being crabs in the hair, and 10 being pale fire at the solstice. And if you would like more stories like this one, about women the world underestimated and the patient wolves who learned to stand beside them without standing in front of them, then do go ahead and subscribe to the channel, because there are a great many more ledgers waiting to be opened, and I intend to read every one of them aloud to you.